Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. And if you're watching us on YouTube, please hit the like, the subscribe button, leave us a comment, leave us a rating. And if you are watching us on YouTube, you know you can always listen to us. Carry us with you on one of those fine podcast platforms. Wherever fine podcasts are found, you can find the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. Let your friends know, let your family members know, your family members' friends, and your friends' family members know that you're listening and how much you're enjoying it. You all know, if you spend any time listening to the show, you know that I love talking economics, and I love talking about economics and policy, and I love doing a little bit of myth busting. And joining me today is Dr. Jonathan Newman. He's from the Mises Institute. Jonathan, I'm going to read your bio, and I'm going to make you blush a little bit here. But he's a prominent economist and a fellow at the Mises Institute. Dr. Newman has made significant contributions to the field of Austrian economics, focusing on topics such as inflation, business cycles, and the history of economic thought. His scholarly work has been published in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics and in edited volumes by Matthew McCaffrey and Per Bylund. He has also taught courses on macroeconomics and quantitative economics at the Mises Graduate School. In addition to his academic pursuits, and I can't wait to talk about this, Dr. Newman is the author of two children's books, The Broken Window and Ludwig, the Builder. His insights and commentary are regularly featured in the Mises Wire and Power and Market. He earned his PhD at Auburn University while serving as a research fellow at the Mises Institute. Dr. Newman, thank you so very much for joining us.
Hey, Andrew, it's good to be here with you.
It's great to have you. And you know, folks, so what happened is Jonathan and I, well, actually, I follow Jonathan. I don't remember if Jonathan follows me on social media, on Twitter. And one of the things came across my transom, my virtual transom, as it were, was a post that he had written, Busting Myths by Robert Reich. Now, this is the era in which we now live. Now, Jonathan, let's talk a little bit about Secretary Reich and his background. And he's one of these guys who has been wrong many times more than he's been right when it comes to economics. And yet there's a whole school of people that still listen to him talk about this and talk about the myth busting.
Yeah, so Reich is a part of this group. I would include Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren in the same group. It's this very progressive part of the left. And really, they talk a lot about inequality. They talk about labor unions and minimum wage legislation. And it seems like they're always working backwards. It seems like they have this sort of utopian dream about what the world could look like or what the U.S. could look like. And then they sort of work backwards from that to get to the policies that will redistribute wealth, that will regulate big businesses. But in Reich's case, he considers himself an economist. And as we know, economics is all about objective cause and effect. Right. We might have our own policy prescriptions, our own policy ideas, but in order to get to that, we have to first establish, what policies will bring about our desired effects. And it just seems to me that Reich and others like him are sort of working backwards. So that's his modus operandi.
It's interesting, right? Because so a lot of times I will quote David Stockman, and I know, there are folks these days who don't like David Stockman anymore. But David Stockman wrote a book in the 80s called The Triumph of Politics. And normally it is sitting literally, Jonathan, right here on my desk. Someone has absconded with it looks like. But he talks about how the different schools of economic thought approach societal problems. And he talks about the left and the leftist approach as the bloodier process, right? As you're trying to sort of reshape human emotion. Your thoughts on this idea, right? Of this idea of focusing on trying to reshape human nature in some kind of weird image. Also, of course, we'll get to the issue of objectivity and the surreality in which the left lives, but talk about the bloodiness of the process by which they want to go about reshaping the world.
So every economist sort of starts with some fundamental assumptions. And here at the Mises Institute, we champion Austrian economics.
Yes.
We take people as they are. So we take real human beings, and all of the economic theory that is developed by people like Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises is based on this idea that, people are limited, people have purposes. They might be wrong. They have different ideas about how to achieve different goals, but they can be wrong some of the times. And so we just take people as they are. Now, in the mainstream economics, they go in a different direction. They try to mathematize the whole thing. So they come up with this homo economicus, this idea that we can model human behavior with mathematical equations. And whenever there's anything that happens in markets that seems like it goes against that, it means that markets have failed. So they have this sort of like perfect idea of what man is and what he ought to be. And then they sort of reason out from that starting point. But from the left, it seems like they're taking like a Marxist sort of approach, that people exist in different classes, that there's this one class that is privileged, that has all of the economic power and all of the political power. And so we ought to come up with policies that will punish them and redistribute their wealth to a different class that deserves all of that wealth redistribution. So those are the three main ways that I see at least the prominent schools of thought today are thinking about what humans are and how they act and yeah. So what is the fundamental starting point for economics?
But let's talk about this sort of this lack of we can call it the lack of objectivity, but it really is venturing into surrealism. And I'll give you an example. While he was governor of Maryland, Martin O'Malley, Maryland was just doing poorly economically, right? You had all of this statist, centralized economic policy that was, as one might imagine, crippling the state's economy. Imagine this when you create more regulations and you make it harder for people to engage in business. And we're not talking about the fact that this idea that there should be no regulation, but let's sort of talk about, heaping on red tape to things. So the state's gross, the state version of GDP, folks, the GSP, was faltering. And so he and his cronies created a set of subjective metrics by which to measure the state's healthiness. He called it the General Progress Indicator, the GPI. There's a problem inherent in doing this, isn't there, Jonathan? Talk about why this is a problem.
Well, whenever you're putting together any sort of, aggregate statistic, it's going to be biased by what you include and what you don't include into that statistic. So I'm not sure about the specifics of this measure that you're talking about, but I'm sure that it includes all sorts of things that the political leaders think are important, or things that might be important to some people, but not to others.
Right.
But the idea when you're putting together something like that, what you're doing is you're homogenizing everybody. You're saying that everybody has these sorts of goals, or like when you put together GDP for the whole country, it means that you're sort of taking everybody as like a lump sum.
Right.
You're putting everybody into this one big blob, when in the reality of economics and markets is we're individuals. We have our own preferences. We face different prices. So the prices that I face when I go to the grocery store are different than the prices that other people in Alabama even face in their own communities. Sometimes, even within the community, there are different grocery stores with different prices. But the idea is that we're all individuals. We all have our own preferences. We all have our own circumstances. And so whenever you're going to put together these sorts of statistics, you're going to lose some of that reality. You're going to lose the individualism. You're going to lose the subjectivism. You're going to lose what real people face in markets every day.
Talk about, I want to come back to Robert Reich and the myths, but talk about economics as an exercise in sort of psychology and understanding sort of what motivates people. Because you're absolutely right. I shop at two particular grocery stores. For very specific reasons, why I prefer them. And some of it, sometimes there are prices that are better, but sometimes it's the quality of goods or there's the customer service aspect. Talk about that aspect of it and sort of what goes into the psychology of all of this.
Yeah. So in Austrian economics, like I said, we treat everybody as an individual.
Right.
So we take people's preferences as a given. It's not something that we're going to try to speculate. It's actually not even a part of economics to discuss like what specifically motivates people. We just take those motivations as a given when we're
They are
developing.
motivated. That is the fact. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
In a wide variety of ways.
And rational, meaning that
Yes.
they just have a reason for doing the things that they're doing. So if that's your starting point for economics, you're going to come to radically different conclusions. So at the end of the so you can think about economics as like starting with some assumptions. So like if you start with the assumption that people are different, they have different circumstances, different preferences, that's going to lead you to put together this body of economic thought, the cause and effect. If you impose these price controls, then that's going to result in these sorts of effects. And then that leads to policy conclusions. So like if we want a free and prosperous society, if we want higher standards of living, then these are the policies. And in Austrian economics, the conclusions that we come to are laissez-faire. It's that,
Yes.
let people be free to make their own choices. So if you have that sort of trajectory, starting with real humans and individuality, then that leads to free markets, free people. But if you have a different set of starting assumptions, like I mentioned, the Homo economicus or viewing people in classes, that's going to lead you to different policy conclusions,
Right.
like we need to regulate, we need to impose price controls.
That's where you get Bernie Sanders out there openly wondering why we have X number of different kinds of toothpaste or X number of different kinds of sneakers out there.
Yeah, what a terrible tragedy that we have all these choices at the grocery store.
Right. I mean, yeah, right. I mean, it's one of those things of and of course, where does it end in terms of the policy, right? All of a sudden you have one kind of bread and it's black bread and it's, made one day a year. I'm sorry, I'm sort of taking it to the nth degree and sort of the Soviet style, the Marxist style of doing things. Let's talk about specifically Reich and the myths, because this is what caught my eye. I found it brilliant and more importantly, so very much helpful at a time where we are divided and there is a lack of economic literacy out there, which is a tragedy. Talk about the myth busting.
Yeah, the lack of economic literacy is on full display in these videos. So I think he's done 4 by now, and I've written responses to the first 2. But when I saw the third one and the fourth one, I was like, this is barely even worth responding to. Right. It's so silly. It's so surface level. And it's especially in those 2, it's just like pure politics where I don't really have much to say about what he's saying. But in the first one, the myth that he's trying to debunk is that economics is objective, that we can actually have objective cause and effect claims coming out of the body of economic thought. And so in his ideal economics is in like this mush with politics and morality. So it's not this unified body of thought that gives us objective cause and effect claims. It's just what do we want society to look like? In fact, I think that's a quote from his video. Like the central economic question for Reich is, what do we want our society to look like? And then the rest of the video, it's only 3 minutes long, so it's like a huge topic that people have written books about. And he's got this silly cartoon animation 3 minutes long, where he pretends to have debunked this idea. And really the only 2 bits of information that he gives is that Adam Smith considered himself a moral philosopher, and economics used to be called political economics.
Sure,
so like political economy.
Yes.
Those are both true things, right?
Yes,
but to say
still,
that, to just offer those 2 things and say, therefore economics is in a mush with politics and morality.
Well, biology used to be called natural science. It doesn't mean that we sort of have to go back and we don't do research into why things happen with biology anymore. We can say, hey, it's just natural. It's natural. Anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. You're exactly right. So it's not a good argument. It's barely an argument if think about it that way. So what I did in my article is I tried to present the best possible case that Reich could have made. So this is something that Mises does a lot in his work, especially in Human Action, where he's responding to all of these critics of the free market ideas. And a lot of times what he'll see in their literature is they actually haven't given an argument. But here's the argument that they could have made. Here's the best possible argument that they could have made. Right. And then he addresses that argument. And it's not a straw man, that's steel manning, that's saying, here's the best possible case against this, and here's why that argument still fails. And so that's what I did with Reich here. And so the best possible case that he can make is that the way that we think about markets and economics oftentimes is is based on the assumption that private property exists. So like
Yes.
when we go to the market to exchange money for goods or goods for goods, we have this idea that people own the things that they're trading.
Right.
And you can find quotes in Mises and other Austrian economists saying the same thing, that private property is like this fundamental starting point for
100%.
the existence of markets. But then I go on to show how that doesn't mean that all of economics is biased, that all of economics is based in this political moral mush. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, it's just I was reminded of something. Go right ahead.
Yeah. So economics is not in this political and
Right.
moral mush. When we bring in the assumptions about laws that enforce private property, what we're doing is we're just saying this is the real world. So like we exist in a world where there are moral norms, where we have laws that enforce private property rights, which means that
Right.
we can have markets. And so
Right.
all of the economic laws that we develop that pertain to markets are simply based on what we see in the real world. It's not that we're starting with people ought to have private property rights or people ought to
Sure.
have any sort
Right.
of legal codes. What we're saying is that here's the conditions that actually exist. Here are the economic laws that pertain to this particular circumstance, and then we go from there.
Presaging modern government, the concept of private property rights is something that is inherent in mankind's nature. The idea of I have this is mine, it is mine to give or sell or trade or what have you. Right? That's something innate in who we are as people. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you're absolutely right. But the idea is that we're looking out in the world, seeing the circumstances that exist, and then applying economic laws to the circumstances that we see. It doesn't bias the analysis when we're doing that sort of thing. And so I drew an analogy to an engineer or a physicist trying to explain the flight of an airplane.
Sure.
And in order to do that, you're going to have to rely on the laws of physics. You're going to have to, and those are the things that we
Right.
would consider as like the laws of economics in the analogy. But in order to explain the flight of an airplane, you also have to bring in the gravity of Earth, which is a specific
Yes.
condition. You have to bring in the air drag. You have to bring in all of these the weight of the airplanes. So the specific conditions of the thing that you're trying to explain.
Absolutely.
But that doesn't bias the overall analysis. All that does is it just constrains your analysis, and it says we're looking at this particular situation. Another good example that I didn't put in this.
I'm sorry, Jonathan. Before you get to the other example, it's a brilliant way of putting it, and thank you very much for doing that. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, thank you. So another thing that we can point to is that economists also study socialist economies.
Right.
So we look at price controls. We look at cases where the government owns everything.
And hold on for 1 second before you go down that road. You know, the two of the most helpful economics classes I took as an undergrad, and I was a Soviet studies major in college, were centrally planned economies and comparative economic systems. Centrally planned economies, especially because you could watch the failures in real time. But go ahead.
I was just going to say that when we do that sort of thing, we're just bringing in a different set of circumstances.
Right.
So like we can apply the objective tools of economics, the cause and effect claims, to any sort of situation without biasing the analysis on a fundamental level, which is what I think Reich thinks must happen. So like there's no way to do economics without bringing in morality and politics, according to him. But I think his debunking is bunk.
It's interesting because it gets down to, this is sort of what raised my idea. You know, when I used to do way too much debating on the old internet, Usenet, and someone would, some Marxist or worse, a Maoist would come in and say, "How dare you force me?" This is amazing to me. How dare you force me to live under a capitalistic system? As though this idea of living in a free society was somehow forcing you to do anything. And I know that's a political thing it's an economic thing as well, but the political side of it is force. I mean, again, it's the worst kind of a red herring argument as far as I'm concerned. I think you would agree with that.
Oh yeah, and it flies in the face of like what we've seen in socialist experiments.
Right.
So like whenever socialism is imposed and totalitarian governments are put in place, those governments have to put in place walls to keep people in,
right?
As opposed to borders and walls that would keep people out, right? So it seems like every time those sorts of experiments are tried, everybody wants to get away, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely true. And again, folks, I'm not sure in terms of the release schedule, but I just had a conversation. I was telling Jonathan about this. Just had a conversation with a documentary filmmaker who's done a series of films about women entrepreneurs in places like Sri Lanka and Peru and Senegal. And it sort of gets down to this idea of if you free people to do for themselves, they do better. So that was myth number one. Let's talk about myth number two.
Yeah, so myth number two is government obstructs the free market. And here he's talking about all,
near and dear to my heart.
He's saying that he's saying that government doesn't obstruct the free market. He says that government is a precondition for markets to exist. And then he goes on to say that big businesses and rich people have way too much power. They have way too much leverage over the laws that are written. And so I think he's mostly right here. So like when he's talking about all of the influence that big businesses have over the U.S. government, yeah, I think he's diagnosed something that's correct. Like there definitely is an issue with that. I do have some quibbles about government being a precondition for markets. I think we can have
let's talk about that.
Yeah. Oh, sure. So especially in the Austrian school, there's a wide literature of how things like private security, private contract enforcement can exist, that you don't necessarily need a coercive government in place. You can have a voluntary system in which people are enforcing the rules that are within contracts without the coercive government element, which means that you don't necessarily need government enforcement of private property in order for markets to exist. But that's really sort of like a side issue here. The main thing that I wanted to address is that Reich is essentially correct that there is too much big business control over the levers in Washington. But go ahead.
Sorry, but the difference, of course, is it's when they're calling for policies that benefit themselves at the expense of others, that's cronyism. Or when they're advocating for policies that take money out of one person's pocket and puts it into their own, that's a problem. But Reich, weirdly enough, the left and the whether it's the Marxists or whomever, they don't see a problem with the transfusion of cash out of the public fisc into the hands of private business. They just want to be able to control it more.
That's right. Yeah. So in his ideal world, it's not that there wouldn't be all of these people trying to control the levers of power in Washington.
Right.
He just wants strong labor unions. He wants progressive politicians implementing things that would regulate business and make them not get too big. So the way I think about it is he just wants, more people playing the hungry hippos game, where there's more people, slamming on the levers trying to get what they can get. But I pointed to, so first of all, his analysis is very superficial. It's like, this is a problem, but he never really asked like why. So why is it that big businesses are trying to get control in Washington? Why do they spend so much on lobbying, right? And the answer, of course, is that the government just has too much power.
Right.
There's just so much at stake in the writing of laws. There's really nothing that the government doesn't regulate in our day-to-day lives. And so because the government has all of this power, it means that there's substantial benefit in lobbying politicians to get the laws that you want, so that you could punish your competitors, so that your business can get the subsidy, your business can get the big government contracts. But if you just took that away, if we had a system with limited government, then that would limit the benefit of lobbying politicians. So if politicians couldn't do that sort of thing, then there'd be no reason to spend billions on lobbying.
I've long said, right, if you want to really deal with corruption in Washington, D.C., or any state capital, right, or any place where government is making decisions, right, where politicians are paid off for a decision they're making, take away the power of that politician to make that decision, and the impetus to bribe a politician goes away, right? Whether it's, the fat telecom deal or the fat energy deal or what have you. The other part of this is, it's funny, Jonathan, because I was a lobbyist for the National Federation of Independent Business for 6 years. So the nation's largest small business association. And I always knew that something dangerous was coming down the road when big government, big business, and big labor would get together. I knew they were coming after my members that were out there. So, this is what happens. Hold on, but I want to come back to something.
Sure.
Because there is an overarching theme in what you're saying with myth number 2 that Reich says about the issue of government interference with the marketplace, or how did you term it? How did you term myth number 2?
So he calls it government obstructs the free market.
Government
so
obstructs
he's
the
trying,
free market.
Yeah, he's trying to bust that myth, and he's saying that government doesn't obstruct the free market.
All right, because he goes down this road of the protectionism side of things. But there's a whole thing that is missed, which is the issue of regulatory costs, which is very near and dear to my heart. It's outside of the podcast work that I do or the radio work that I do, this is how I make my living. I deal with regulatory issues. This is a real problem, and it starts with the justification on the part of the left that regulations don't have cost. In fact, the White House last year proposed a whole new series of guidelines in terms of regulatory cost measurement that essentially gets rid of regulatory cost measurement. They only want to talk about the benefits of regulation. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this issue. The overall theme, government and government regulation has a cost on the economy, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Like I said, there's really nothing that's not regulated by the U.S. government these days. Like every single thing that we use, everything that we do, there's something where government has manipulated it, changed it, caused people to do something other than what they would have done. And so all of this is a huge burden. So if you stick the government's finger into the economic pie, so to speak, then it's going to destroy the pie. It's going to mess it up. It's going to make it different than it otherwise would have been. But the lesson of laissez-faire of free markets is that the market is totally fine at regulating itself, and the reason why is because consumers care about the products that they consume. And so if there's something about a product that is wrong, or if there's something about the way the product is being produced that consumers don't like, they respond by purchasing something else, by decreasing the profits of the company or the industry that's doing the thing that the consumers don't like. So there's already a perfect and very responsive regulation that's already built into the market process, primarily through profit and loss. So whenever government is going to get in the way, it's going to distort that process, make it slower, make it not work entirely sometimes, and it's going to cause industry and companies to deliver products that consumers don't like as much.
Let's talk a little bit about this other part of it. Something I talk about quite a bit is opportunity cost. There was I don't know if you've seen the study. I'm going to bring it up, and you can go verify it for yourself. But two economists, one at North Carolina State, one at Appalachian State, Dawson and Cedar, about 10 years ago, did a study about opportunity cost. And essentially, to distill it down, for every dollar in direct regulatory cost, there's a $19 multiplier in opportunity cost loss there. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this and to talk a little bit about how we measure direct regulatory costs, but we seem to forget that a dollar that is lost here or in a mandate, how that changes productivity or investment. Talk a little bit about the opportunity cost side of it.
Yeah, so I'll point out the grammar that I was using in my last response. So notice I was saying the government does something and that causes consumers to have a product that's different or that they don't like as much as what they would have had. So that's some strange grammar, what they would have had. And that's exactly where opportunity costs come in. So opportunity costs refer to the alternative, this unseen path that markets could have gone down, but they don't because of some event, some policy, something that messes things up at the beginning. And so the opportunity cost can be, I don't doubt that $19 per $1 figure that you mentioned. In fact, that could be an understatement, right? So because
well, I appreciate that.
Because we can't see what markets would have looked like without the regulations. And so like I said, all costs are opportunity costs, which means that that's the only way that we should be thinking about costs. First of all, we shouldn't be ignoring costs. Like you mentioned, they're just going to be calculating the benefits. So we shouldn't be ignoring costs. And the way that we think about costs should be based on that opportunity cost level, where we think about where markets would have gone, what products would have been developed, how industry would have innovated absent those interventions and regulations by the government.
Is this what you talk about in Broken Window? Because I know I frequently talk about opportunity cost and talk about at least one example of the broken window theory, which is the idea of, the left says that that regulation creates economic activity because you have whole new industries that spring up because of regulation, you sort of deal with it. And I say, well, that's like a glazier, a window repair guy saying, I need to drum up business, so I'm going to send a kid down to the local strip mall and break a bunch of windows. And that's going to create economic activity for me. That's not economic. Is that what the Broken Window book is about, or is it about something else?
You're exactly right. That's what the broken window. That's what the broken window parable is all about. Yeah. It's all about recognizing opportunity costs. It's about recognizing the fact that when we break stuff, that can redirect spending and business activity into one direction, but it comes at a cost. It means that the shopkeeper or the baker whose window was broken now has less resources for himself. Right. And he would have spent the money on a new pair of shoes or a suit, depending on which version that you read, as opposed to just merely repairing the window. So the opportunity cost is what matters. What that community lost when the window was broken was what the baker would have done if his window wasn't
an online
broken.
ordering system, or ordering better. I'm sorry, now it's approaching lunchtime when we're recording right now, so I'm now thinking about a bagel restaurant. But okay, good. So I'm glad about that, because I've got a couple of kids I want to buy these books for. Talk about the second children's book.
Yeah, so the next one is called Ludwig the Builder, and it's based on Austrian business cycle theory. Yeah. Ludwig von Mises, who's one of the champions of Austrian economics, he wrote a wonderful treatise on economics called Human Action. I encourage, if you're a graduate student, college student, you should check that out. But if you're younger than that, then maybe you should start with some of these children's books like Broken Window and Ludwig the Builder. In Ludwig the Builder, this house builder named Ludwig starts building a house based on an assumption that he has way more resources than he actually does. Sure. So he's tricked by Fred, the warehouse manager. Fred tells him that he has lots of resources, and so Ludwig starts building a very big house, which requires a lot of resources. And then only midway through the project, he realizes that he doesn't have enough resources to finish the house, which means he has to tear down the house as much as he's built and reformulate a plan. So he has to come up with a plan to build a smaller house based on the resources that he actually has. And that's the only way that he can complete the project. And so this is a beautiful analogy for the business cycle according to Austrian economics. And so Austrian business cycle theory, just in a few words, is that the economy sometimes gets tricked by low interest rates. So when the Federal Reserve and the banking system is pushing interest rates down, increasing the money supply, we have artificial credit expansion, that tricks entrepreneurs into thinking that there are more saved resources than actually exist. And so they start all these big long-term projects. We saw this in the housing boom, by the way, where which in this case is actually houses. It's a perfect analogy where builders are making these huge neighborhoods full of huge houses, right? But then there's a day of reckoning where we realize, hey, actually the resources aren't here. Capital is more scarce than I anticipated, which means that we have to go back to the drawing board and come up with production plans that actually match our available resources. And that, by the way, is the recession. That's the bust, right? So most economists, like especially the Keynesian variety, they look at the bust as the thing that needs to be fixed. So like we have this recession, unemployment is increasing, and so we need government intervention to bring spending back up, bring employment back up. But they're looking in the wrong place. They should be looking at all the mistakes that were made during this artificial boom. So all of the production mistakes were made when there was all this cheap credit. So cheap credit is what initiates this boom. And so if you want to prevent depressions in the business cycle, you just have to let the market decide what interest rates are going to be. So let savers and consumers decide how much they want to spend, how much they want to save, and let interest rates be established on that as opposed to political will.
And at the same time, don't massively ramp up regulatory costs, or God forbid, right, as you're trying to fix this, ease some of the rules that are out there so that folks aren't mired in red tape, right? It's funny because that was something that I didn't quite understand, years ago, working with, watching the transition from one administration to the next in terms of the focus on small business. And I know there's a lot of debate over whether or not we should focus on small businesses. I was working for small business at the time. But the idea of the one approach is the one that I think you and I would agree on, Wayne Cruz, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, just get out of the way. As Wayne says, you don't have to teach the grass to grow. You just have to remove the rocks from the lawn. Whereas the left focuses on access to credit almost like an obsession, right? They want to eliminate risk in terms of lending, which is just bizarre, right? So you have ever more marginal people people of ever more marginal creditworthiness that financial institutions aren't supposed to calculate the risk. Because government will be the solution down the road in terms of bailing them out. I mean, there's a cycle here. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. So the regulations, the red tape, that can only exacerbate the problem, and sometimes it can actually direct the bad credit into specific industries. So like what we saw in the housing boom is there were all of these government regulations that were designed to encourage people who weren't as creditworthy to borrow so that they can buy a house.
Sure.
And so what you had is a bunch of people who were, taking advantage of those incentives that they faced. And that's what led to the creation of the housing boom. So government regulation and the red tape that you're talking about, it can funnel that easy credit into one particular industry sometimes. And like you said, when we're trying to go through the recovery process during the recession, when we should be, reevaluating what we're doing and trying to find productive uses for our capital goods, find productive employment for people, the red tape and the regulation just gets in the way and hinders that process where we should be making those healthy corrections.
It also points to this idea that when you have a single metric as part of your public policy goal, so single metric being getting as many people as possible to own a house or getting as many people as possible to have a college degree, it leads to all kinds of bad consequences policy-wise and thus economically, doesn't it?
You're right. So in the market, what regulates it? It's profit and loss.
Right.
So companies will produce as long as it's profitable. They're going to try to design products that consumers want. And the reason why is because they're aiming for profit. As soon as they make a mistake, as soon as they produce something that consumers don't want, they incur losses.
Right.
And so there's this natural feedback loop in the market economy. But as you mentioned, in government, there is no such feedback loop. At best, you have this like very indirect, slow, confusing feedback through democracy, whereas like maybe voters don't like the sorts of policies that are being enacted, and so they vote differently. But as we've seen, it's very easy to dupe people. It's very easy to propagandize voters into ignoring what they see on a day-to-day basis. And so I don't think that there's much to that sort of feedback system. And so instead what we have is, like you said, the government is using all of these other metrics, like everybody needs a college degree. Everybody deserves a home. And so what that results in is a huge misallocation of resources, lower standards of living, more regulation, more costs, and a slower economy that's not functioning correctly.
How do we explain to people so that they can understand it, that when you forgive student loans, it drives up the cost of education?
There's a great paper. I can't remember the authors, but they basically looked at decades of history in higher education, and what they found out is that any sort of federal student aid, anything that the government does to try to encourage people to go get a college degree, all it does is it's almost like a one-to-one sort of thing where every dollar that's spent in that direction just causes tuition to increase. And of course that's obvious. Like anybody who understands economics understands that if you increase the demand for something, then the price is going to go up. And so anything that you do to try to artificially stimulate demand into one particular thing for one particular product, all you're going to do is either distort the process or just cause higher prices.
So before I let you go, because I do want to, one more substantive issue, and then I want to talk about some fun stuff. So modern monetary theory obviously is contrasted with the Austrian school. You just did a podcast on this. Did that camp, the modern monetary theory camp, correctly predict the post-COVID economy?
No, they didn't.
Yeah.
So they were actually really
Shocker.
Silent. They were very silent during those years when price inflation was going through the roof. And I think it's because they realized that, hey, all these things where we were saying, don't worry about inflation. The government can print and spend as much as it wants to, and everything will be okay. And then, the price inflation actually occurred, and they got really quiet during that period. And only now, in the past year or so, had they started to come out of the woodwork and say, actually, we do have an explanation for that. But what I've seen, they don't really have a good explanation because it's based on things like corporate greed or
right.
It's totally counter to what we know about economic theory.
Let's scapegoat.
So I don't think they called it.
God forbid we print money, we increase demand artificially, raises the cost of goods. But at the same time, we're also, adding another $1 trillion to the regulatory state. We're raising the cost of energy and energy production and consumption. So none. It's just corporate greed that's doing it. That's the amazing thing. So let me ask you this: so when you're not doing this work, and I ask this of all my guests, if I had added a fourth podcast to the litany of podcasts that I do, I was going to do one called Outside Interests to sort of talk to folks about the stuff they do that isn't policy or political oriented. What are you doing when you're not doing your economics work?
Well, so I have 3 kids. I have a 6-year-old, a 3-year-old, and an infant. She was born on Christmas Day, actually.
Oh, congratulations.
And thank you. And so a lot of my time outside of work is, just playing with my kids and spending time with the family. We like to go to the lake. There's a lake nearby. We do some fishing. We do some swimming. We do lots of fun stuff with our church as well. So that's how I spend most of my time outside of work these days.
So the 2 children's books, Ludwig the Builder and The Broken Window, are they available on Amazon?
Yes, they are. Yeah,
Excellent.
And also at the Mises bookstore.
Which would you prefer? Do you prefer or does it not matter?
It doesn't matter.
Good.
Yeah.
I'm going to go order them for a bunch of folks today. How do folks find out more about the good work that you are doing at the Mises Institute?
So if you go to Mises.org, MISES.org, then you can find my articles there. So we have a main, it's called the Mises Wire, where we have our big articles. And then we have a side blog called Power and Market, where I and other contributors are talking about current events and all things that are related to Austrian economics and freedom and peace and those sorts of things. So that's where you can check me out.
And how do folks find you on Twitter?
So I'm on Twitter. You can probably just search for my name and find me, Jonathan Newman. The handle that I was able to get was Newman J_R. So it's a little harder to remember, but sure. Yeah, I'm on Twitter as well.
We'll find you there. Well, Jonathan Newman, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. This has been great.
This has been another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. You can check us out, as I've said. If you're watching us on YouTube, please hit the like button, the subscribe button, leave a comment, leave a review. If you're watching us, you can always catch us on wherever fine podcasts are found on the audio side of things. Again, tell your friends and family members, tell everybody you know how much you're enjoying the Lunch Hour. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.